The silence of the house was a conscious entity this morning, heavier and more deliberate than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath to emphasize my absence from their collective memory. I am Clara, 72, and the air today smelled exactly like a day that should be filled with balloons, hurried phone calls, and the synthetic scent of cheap paraffin wax. Instead, it smelled of stale coffee, dust motes dancing in the cold, winter sunlight, and the quiet, persistent thrum of my own unacknowledged existence. It was my birthday. 72. A number that felt both impossibly long and yet entirely unfinished. I had woken early, before the first week light, with that specific, childlike flutter of anticipation, the biological imperative that insists on celebration, even when logic suggests polite resignation. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking at the familiar, unmoving face of the telephone. I tried to suppress the calculation. Julian is in London. He'll call later. The time difference is difficult. Beatrice is with the baby. She's exhausted. The noise of the phone would wake him. My sister? Evelyn. Well, Evelyn is Evelyn. She remembers what suits her. The excuses were polished, practiced shields I had carried for decades, protecting me from the sharp, direct truth. They forgot. Or worse, they remembered, and judged the event unworthy of their precious, limited time. By 10 o'clock, the damage was undeniable. The single, perfunctory text message from Julian, my son, arrived at 10:04 a.m., a flat, digital ping that offered no warmth. Happy B-Day, Mom. Hope you have a good one. Crazy day here? Talk soon. J. No capital letters, no exclamation marks, just the necessary minimal effort of duty discharged. Beatrice, my daughter, sent a slightly more elaborate message at 11:30 a.m., complete with a celebratory emoji. OMG, happy B-Day, Mom. So sorry I missed the morning. Leo was up all night. Hope you treat yourself. XOXO. Treat myself. The modern euphemism for, we didn't organize anything, so you must fill the gap yourself. Evelyn, my sister, did not call. She was the most painful absence, the one person who carried the same memories, the same shared history, the same obligation of kinship. Her silence was a deep, cold well, reflecting back the truth of my own diminished importance. I made myself a simple lunch, half a tuna sandwich and a glass of water. I ate it slowly, listening to the vast, mocking silence of the house. I had spent my entire life as the architect of other people's celebrations, the careful planner of anniversaries, the relentless baker of birthday cakes, the steady, constant reservoir of attention. Now, the roles were simply reversed. The reservoir was empty, and the architects were too busy building their own separate worlds to spare a single brick for mine. If the only thing you have left to give is patience, does that patience eventually turn into a corrosive resentment? The truth of being entirely alone on the one day designated for acknowledgement felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I felt the familiar, dangerous spiral of self-pity beginning. 72. What have I done with all that time? Why is the harvest of my devotion so spare, so thin? I needed air. I needed to move, to replace the suffocating stillness of the house with the indifferent, sprawling motion of the outside world. I pulled on my thickest wool coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and walked out into the chilly November afternoon. The air was sharp, clean, and bracing. I walked the familiar loop around the neighborhood, the same walk I had taken every day for the last 30 years. Past the Miller's house, where the lights were still off, suggesting they were away. Past the Johnsons', where the noise of children's laughter was a sharp, piercing sound. I walked faster, driven by the need to outrun the sudden, unexpected sting of tears. I refused to cry today. Tears were the currency of self-pity, and I wanted dignity, even if it was a solitary dignity. As I approached my own house again, already contemplating the quiet misery of the evening ahead, I saw something small and white lying against the dark, bristly choir of my doormat. It was a piece of folded, heavy, cream-colored cardstock, obviously slipped there recently, perhaps only minutes before. It was not a flyer. It was not an advertisement. I stopped, my heart giving a sudden, anxious lurch. I bent down, my fingers stiff with cold, and picked it up. The paper was thick, luxurious, and smelled faintly of expensive lavender. The writing was a looping, elegant script, unfamiliar to me, written in dark, archival ink. It was not Julian's hurried scribble or Beatrice's round, childish hand. I unfolded the card. The message was simple, stark, and utterly unsettling. You deserve better. Meet me at the pier at sunset. No name, no signature. Just the clear, direct command and the alarming, intimate statement. You deserve better. My mind immediately began to spin, running through all the logical possibilities. A prank, certainly. Teenagers playing a cruel game. Or perhaps a neighbor, one of the newer ones, misidentifying me, mistaking me for someone else. Or worse, a sinister, calculated approach. But the phrase hung in the air, resonant and powerful. You deserve better. It was exactly what the quiet, wounded voice inside me had been whispering all day. It was the affirmation of my own overlooked worth. I looked at the pier. It was visible from my street, a weathered wooden structure jutting out into the cold, choppy gray of the Atlantic, usually deserted at this time of year. I walked inside, pulling off my coat, and looked at the clock. 4 o'clock. Sunset would be around 5:30 p.m. I had 90 minutes to wrestle with the absurdity, the potential danger, and the small, reckless flicker of hope. Does a woman, utterly starved of attention, reach out for any hand offered, even if it risks humiliation? I spent the next hour pacing the length of my living room carpet, drinking cold tea, running through the possibilities. If it was a genuine message, who would send it? A former student? I retired from teaching 8 years ago. An old friend I'd lost touch with? No one I could place. The message was too personal, too pointed. By 5:15 p.m., the sky was already turning a deep, bruised purple and rose. I knew I should stay home. I should embrace the quiet dignity of my loneliness. I should not chase a childish, impossible mystery. But the text messages lay flat and cold on my counter. The phone remained silent. The thought of spending the next 5 hours alone, staring at the television, felt like a slow, deliberate drowning. The flicker of hope, the reckless refusal to be utterly predictable, won. I put my coat back on, checked my purse for my house keys and my small canister of pepper spray, a gift from Beatrice I had mocked but never discarded, and walked out the door. The pier was utterly deserted. The November wind was fierce, smelling strongly of salt and decay, whipping my hair around my face. The wooden planks beneath my feet groaned mournfully under my weight. I walked halfway down the long, exposed structure, feeling ridiculous, vulnerable, and profoundly disappointed. It was exactly as I should have known. A prank. The final, sharp sting of a day marked by disappointment. I stopped at the railing, pulling my coat tighter, and looked out at the churning gray water, resolving to turn around and face my quiet evening. "Clara?" The voice was soft, hesitant, carried on the wind from behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing near the base of the pier, just out of the reach of the coldest wind, was an elderly woman. She was shorter than me, dressed in a thick, old-fashioned coat, with a scarf wrapped tightly over her head. Her face was lined, familiar in its generalized old age sorrow, but absolutely, definitively not a face I knew. She started walking toward me slowly, carefully navigating the uneven planks. "You are Clara Hale, aren't you?" she asked, her voice raspy, yet gentle. "Yes," I replied, gripping the pepper spray canister in my coat pocket, refusing to take it out. "Who are you? And why did you send that note?" She stopped a few feet away, her eyes, a pale, startling blue, fixed on mine. They were eyes that looked like they had witnessed decades of difficult things. "I am Elspeth," she said, pulling her scarf down slightly. "And I sent the note because I saw your despair. I saw you walking this afternoon, and I felt it. I know that feeling of being completely forgotten on the day you deserve the most light." I was stunned, not by the revelation, but by the raw, intimate accuracy of her observation. "I don't know you, Elspeth. How could you possibly know about my day?" She offered a small, knowing smile, the kind that held an entire novel's worth of regret. But I knew your mother, Clara, intimately. Before you were born, before I moved away, we were closer than sisters." My mother, Rose. Rose had died 20 years ago, a complex, difficult woman whose silence about her past had always felt less like protection and more like a deliberate, frustrating erasure. "You knew my mother?" I asked, the skepticism melting away, replaced by a sudden, intense longing for connection. "You never visited. I never heard her mention an Elspeth." "No, I know," she conceded. Rose was meticulous about her silences. She feared entanglement, Clara. And I am here now because I believe I have delayed this for too long. I have something of hers, something urgent, that I realized, watching you today, you finally need. Elspeth reached into the large, deep pocket of her coat and produced a small, battered wooden box. It was a simple thing, dark oak, with a small, tarnished brass latch. It looked immensely old. "She gave me this box 60 years ago, the day I left," Elspeth explained, holding it out to me. "She made me promise never to open it, but to deliver it to you, her daughter, only when I believed you had reached the point of maximum necessity, when you were broken, but not yet completely lost." I hesitated, looking from the small box to Elspeth's earnest, weathered face. "What is it?" "It is her unsent life, Clara," Elspeth said, her voice dropping. "It is the record of the life she truly wanted, before she became the mother and wife you knew. It's the life she tried to erase. Read it. It will tell you who you are and who you still have time to become." She pressed the box into my cold hands. The wood was smooth, worn, and surprisingly heavy. "I can't take this," I stammered, overwhelmed by the sudden, massive weight of the past. "You must," she insisted, taking a small step backward. "And don't look for me again, Clara. I've completed my promise. Your mother's life is now your challenge." And then, before I could ask another question, she turned, walking quickly away from me, melting into the deepening gloom of the sunset, leaving me utterly alone on the pier, holding the heavy, complicated heart of my mother's secrets. I did not go back inside immediately. I walked slowly home, carrying the wooden box like a fragile, priceless relic. The sheer, shocking weight of the discovery, the certainty that a part of my mother's life had existed entirely outside the rigid domestic reality she had constructed, made the coldness of the evening feel irrelevant. The unsent life. I sat at my kitchen table, my own single birthday candle unlit in the center, and placed the box between my hands. I ran my fingers over the tarnished brass latch. The box was not locked. I simply flipped the latch and slowly lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled against a piece of yellowed silk, was a stack of letters. They were bound tightly with a piece of brittle, faded velvet ribbon. The paper was thin, airmail weight, and the writing was my mother's familiar, elegant cursive, smaller and sharper than I remembered. The stack was thick. The letters were addressed to no one, or rather, simply addressed to the sea or to the future. They were dated across a period of nearly 10 years, from just before her marriage to my father, up until the time I was perhaps 7 or 8 years old. I carefully removed the first letter, dated 1948. Dearest C, they call me foolish. They call me reckless. They say that a woman with my education, my training in painting and restoration, should not dream of crossing oceans alone. They say that marriage is the only true safety, the only valid frame for a respectable life. And perhaps they are right. The ship is booked for April. I have my ticket to Florence. I have the address of a studio where they say the light is like liquid gold. But I am terrified. My father has withdrawn his support. He says if I go, I lose my inheritance and my name. He says the price of freedom is the loss of all comfort. And he is offering me a safety net. Your father's hand, his respectable name, his immense, tedious expectations. I look at the ticket, and then I look at the gold band he placed on my finger, and I know I must choose between the color of the paint and the certainty of the silence. I want the paint. I want the reckless, impossible light. But what if I fail, C? What if the light is a trick and I am left alone, painting ugly, irrelevant things, freezing in a foreign city? Does a woman ever truly choose freedom, or does she always choose the least terrifying cage? The letter stopped abruptly. There was no signature. I looked at the date, 1948. My parents were married in 1949. My mother had the ticket to Florence. She had the studio address. She had the courage, the fierce, artistic ambition that the Rose I knew, the precise, nervous, judgmental mother, had completely suffocated. My mother had been a painter, a restorer. She wanted the gold light of Florence. The woman I knew only painted the living room walls an antiseptic beige and worried about the dust on the antique furniture. I picked up the next letter, dated 1950, shortly after her marriage to my father. To the future, I am not unhappy. That is the lie I tell myself daily, and the one I offer generously to my husband. The house is perfect. The gardens are ordered. The expectations are clear. I am performing my role with meticulous, silent skill. I am creating a beautiful, predictable life for him. I am giving him the security he craves. But the light here is wrong. It is dim, northern, and flat. It does not feel like liquid gold. It feels like milk that has gone stale. I tried to bring the easel down from the attic last week. He looked at it with that cool, critical gaze of his and said, "Really, Rose? Are we still playing at that? We have a reputation to maintain, darling. We don't want people thinking you're flighty." The easel is back in the attic, covered by a heavy velvet cloth. I painted the dining room gold instead, a poor, cheap substitute for the life I forfeited. I am pregnant now, a daughter. I pray she has my heart, but not my cowardice. I pray she chooses the paint, even if it costs her the comfort. Will she ever know that her quiet, comfortable life was built on the wreckage of my most beautiful, dangerous dreams? I dropped the letter. My eyes were burning, not with sadness, but with a terrible, violent flash of recognition. The courage was the inheritance Rose had tried to pass down, and I, her daughter, had spent 72 years proving my own cowardice, proving I preferred the predictable domestic silence to the terrifying light of my own desires. I had spent my life waiting for the next phone call, the next invitation, the next sign of validation from the very same kind of predictable, demanding people my mother had fled. I had never chosen the paint. I had chosen the beige walls of expectation. The letters continued, a heartbreaking chronology of surrender, the frustration of raising me, the shame of her few, fleeting attempts to paint in secret, the immense, debilitating guilt of being a disappointed woman trying to be a dutiful mother. The final letter, dated just before her death, was barely legible, written in a shaky, frail hand. To my daughter, I am leaving now. Leaving this flat, dull light. I do not have much to offer you but the hope that you do not repeat my error. The greatest wound a woman can inflict on herself is the deliberate silencing of her own truest voice. I chose comfort. I chose security. I chose your father's predictable love over the magnificent, difficult anarchy of my own self. My greatest regret is not the paintings I never painted, but the sheer, terrible volume of time I spent waiting for others to acknowledge my worth instead of simply claiming it for myself. Please, Clara, do not wait for them to remember you. Do not wait for them to celebrate you. They are living their lives, and you must live yours. Take the courage I locked away. Go to Florence. See the light. Paint the ugly, irrelevant things just to prove you can. Do not be like me. Do not let your deepest desire be the comfort of a familiar silence. I sat in the dark kitchen, the letters scattered around me, the single unlit birthday candle, a mocking symbol of the decades I had spent waiting for the warmth of someone else's match. I looked at the phone. It was almost 8 o'clock. No more texts, no calls. Just the silence. But the silence was different now. It was no longer the sound of their forgetting. It was the vast, necessary space required to hear the sound of my own, finally acknowledged desire. I got up, walked to the utility drawer, and pulled out a box of matches. I lit the single candle, watching the small, steady flame bloom in the darkness. Then, I walked into the study, found my passport, and pulled out my laptop. I did not call Julian. I did not call Beatrice. I did not text Evelyn. I did not even look for Elspeth. Instead, I opened the search engine. I typed 3 simple words: flights to Florence. The first result was a flight leaving tomorrow afternoon. I booked the ticket. I booked a small, sun-drenched apartment near the Ponte Vecchio. I found an art supply store that was open late. I confirmed the payment, watching the numbers flash across the screen. The monetary exchange for the freedom I was finally purchasing. The pain of their neglect was still real, a dull, familiar ache. But it was now overshadowed by the thrilling, terrifying light of my mother's unsent future. I would not wait for them to celebrate me. I would celebrate the wreckage of my past and the magnificent, difficult anarchy of my own final life. I would go to Florence. I would find the liquid light. I would finally, fiercely, choose the paint. The single candle flickered, casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls. The house was no longer silent. It was humming, alive, and resolved to a destiny entirely, magnificently, my own. The decision, made in the single candlelit moment of reading my mother's final regret, unleashed an immediate, terrifying anarchy in the orderly structure of my life. I had booked the flight, the small apartment near the Arno, and the studio space. Now came the brutal, practical reality of turning 72 years of domestic inertia into 2 carry-on suitcases. I moved through the house with a desperate surgical focus. The house, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a mausoleum of lost opportunities. Every object a quiet accusation of the life I had chosen instead of the one my mother had desperately wanted for me. I did not pack the elegant wool suits, the cashmere sweaters, or the sensible neutral shoes I had purchased for my predictable retirement. I packed the colors of rebellion, a startling turquoise scarf, a pair of worn, paint-splattered jeans I had worn gardening, and a bright, reckless crimson coat I had purchased impulsively 15 years ago and never worn, because Julian had once remarked it was a bit loud. I packed only 3 books, a dictionary, a small Italian phrase book, and the entire stack of my mother's letters. The letters, worn and brittle, were my only compass. The most difficult task was packing the art supplies. I had not seriously drawn or painted since high school, the talent having been quietly folded away the moment I put on my wedding dress. But I knew the precise box where I had stored the tools of my lost self. A small aluminum case hidden in the back of the attic storage, beneath a mound of christening gowns and baby blankets. The ascent to the attic was difficult, my knees protesting the unnecessary exertion. The air in the attic was dry, dusty, and smelled of forgotten ambitions. I found the aluminum case. Inside, wrapped in a faded green velvet cloth, were my tools: a set of soft graphite pencils, a small tin of watercolor cakes, and a few pristine sheets of thick, cold-press paper. The colors, when I lifted the lid, were shockingly vivid, as if they had been waiting in suspended animation for 5 decades. Do we ever truly lose a talent? Or do we simply bury it so deep that the effort required to retrieve it becomes too terrifying to contemplate? I packed the pencils. I packed the watercolors. I packed the aluminum case. The christening gowns and baby blankets, the remnants of the life I was fleeing, remained behind, irrelevant. I had to perform the final, silent farewell. I walked into Julian's old room. It was meticulously preserved, a museum to the successful, stable boy I had raised. The desk was clear, the bookshelves organized by category, the windows spotless. I stood in the middle of the room, closed my eyes, and remembered the sound of his teenage laughter, the smell of his clean, freshly laundered baseball uniform. I remembered the fierce, protective love I had felt for the small, demanding boy who had anchored my existence. Did my fierce devotion accidentally suffocate his ability to simply be kind? Was my excessive availability the very thing that made me invisible? I walked into Beatrice's room. Her room was warmer, messier, smelling faintly of old perfume and girlish secrets. I ran my hand over the embroidered edge of her childhood quilt. I remembered the long, tear-soaked talks on the bed, the shared worry over her first heartbreak. The connection was deep, biological, and utterly unbreakable, even in its broken state. But the letters had taught me that their neglect was not a failure of their love, but a predictable consequence of my failure of self. I had given them a life so comfortable, so predictable, that my constant presence was simply assumed, a fixture, like the plumbing or the roof. I left the rooms exactly as they were. I did not leave a note. The greatest clarity I could offer was my absence. If they wanted to understand, they would have to confront the profound, sudden vacuum I left behind. The practicalities of leaving a life were astonishingly simple when the emotional attachment was severed. I left the house key under the mat, knowing a cleaning crew was scheduled for the following week. I left a small, sealed envelope for the post office containing change of address forms to a P.O. box I had rented entirely across the state, ensuring a minimum 6-month delay before they could even begin to trace my physical location. I placed a single phone call to Mr. Harrison, my lawyer. "I need you to open the safety deposit box tomorrow, Mr. Harrison, and I need you to initiate the legal transfers immediately. I will be out of the country, and I will be unreachable by my children for the foreseeable future." "Clara, are you certain?" he asked, his voice a concerned rumble. "This is a radical step. I advise you to leave some form of contact." "I am certain, Mr. Harrison," I replied, standing by the door, my 2 small suitcases beside me. "My mother left me a legacy of courage, and I am finally claiming it. I trust you will handle the rest with discretion. You will hear from me when I am ready." I hung up before he could argue further. The sound of the dial tone disconnecting was the clean, sharp sound of my own final liberation. I took the airport shuttle, a discreet, anonymous service I had booked online. Sitting in the back of the silent minivan, watching the familiar landscape of my suburban life recede, I felt a terrifying rush of fear, instantly followed by a profound chemical euphoria. I was abandoning my children. I was walking away from the duty I had embraced for over 50 years. I was choosing my mother's ghost and my own difficult future over the comfort of their predictable disappointment. Is the act of severing ties with your children the greatest failure of motherhood, or the most radical declaration of self-preservation? The airport was a chaotic blur. The security checks, the noise, the crushing anonymity of thousands of people focused only on their own destinations. I found my gate, sinking into the hard plastic seat, watching the flashing, confusing information board. My phone rang. It was an incoming text. I looked at the screen. It was Evelyn. "Happy birthday, Clara. I'm so sorry. I totally lost track of the day. How are you celebrating? Let's talk soon." A moment of pure, raw fury washed over me. Not even a lie, just the lazy, casual admission of her own self-absorption. I looked at the text. I held my thumb over the keyboard. I could send back a single devastating word. Instead, I took a deep breath. I walked to the nearest trash receptacle, and with a swift, final gesture, I dropped the phone into the bin. The feeling of separation was immense, physical, and exhilarating. I had not just silenced my sister. I had silenced the entire demanding architecture of their modern communication. The flight was long, dark, and filled with the low hum of the engine, the perfect, isolating void I needed. I opened the wooden box and read the letters again, letting the fierce, frustrated spirit of my mother's unsent life wash over me. She had suffered the silent death of a stifled artist. I would claim the noisy, messy rebirth of an aging apprentice. I landed in Florence in the late morning. The air was cool, but the light, the famous, luminous liquid light my mother had written about, was immediate and overwhelming. It was sharp, golden, and seemed to illuminate the very texture of the air. I took a taxi to the apartment, a tiny, charming space with tall, narrow windows and worn terracotta floors. It smelled of age, olive oil, and history. I didn't unpack. I didn't shower. I walked straight to the window, opened the shutters, and looked out over the rooftops. I pulled out my aluminum case, the set of graphite pencils, and a small, stiff sheet of cold-pressed paper. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold, old plaster wall. I looked at the light. I looked at the shadows on the ancient brickwork. And then I did the most terrifying thing a woman who has spent 50 years performing predictability could do. I let go of the intention. I let go of the fear of being bad. I let go of the need for an audience. I simply put the pencil to the paper. The pencil moved, clumsy at first, then gaining a surprising, urgent momentum. It was not a landscape. It was not a portrait. It was the chaotic geometry of the window frame, the demanding light, and the frantic, nervous energy pulsing in my own 72-year-old hand. The drawing was ugly, amateur, and utterly, profoundly honest. It was the first true thing I had created in over half a century. When I finished, the pencil dropped from my fingers, and I stared at the crude lines on the page. The silence of the foreign apartment was complete, but it was not the silence of forgetfulness. It was the silence of creation. I realized that my birthday, the day they had all forgotten, was not the end of my story. It was simply the day I was finally, terrifyingly, born. My life, now a raw, exposed canvas, stretched out before me, luminous and demanding. The work had begun.